Hello, I'm Special Forces Master Sergeant Randy McElwee, and in this tape we're going to talk about techniques for taking the fight to the ground. In previous tapes we covered closing distance, and we're going to use that skill along with some of our other key principles to take the fight to the ground. The strategy that we're going to want to employ is close the distance, gain control, take the fight to the ground, and finish the fight. It's important that we first learn how to fall correctly. We're going to start by covering some techniques for safety purposes that you can add into your training that also help you. Once you become proficient, you'll be able to use these techniques to diffuse the energy of a fall or throw used against you so that you can keep fighting. The first one we're going to talk about is called a rear break fall. We've laid out an extra area of mat here because the falls do have quite a bit of impact. And we want you to consider safety in your training when you're doing this as well. Once you get proficient with the break fall techniques and are able to execute them properly, you should be able to execute these falls out under realistic conditions. But for now, let's stick to doing it with this extra padding. The first one we're going to talk about is the rear break fall. In order to do the rear break fall and learn it properly, we're going to start from a seated position. We're going to start as if we're sitting at home watching television. Our feet out in front of us, knees up, our hands kind of crossed in front of us. We're simply going to use this position to help get the body mechanics down. We're going to rock backwards and we're going to curve our back. As we rock backwards, we want to make sure that our back forms a nice circle. Once we get that rocking motion, we're going to add in a slap to the mat in order to dissipate the energy of the fall. As we start to rock back, we're going to bring our hands up in front of us, forming an X. And then when the base of our shoulder blades touch the ground, we're going to smack the mat. As we bring our hands out and diffuse the fall, we want to keep them down at a 45-degree angle. We don't want to let our hands get out too high because we could injure our shoulders. It'll look something like this. Remember, as you're doing it, when you make contact with the ground, exhale, and overemphasize that exhale when you're practicing. Remember, you don't have to slap the mat really hard because once you start doing this on hard ground or even concrete, you'll injure yourself with the slap if you continually practice on mats and are slapping the ground overly hard. When we're doing this technique, we want to eventually get to where we're doing it from a stand-up position. The next step up in our progression is to come up to a squatted position. From here, we can generate a little more power with the fall and break it. What we'll do is remember to keep your chin tucked, lay back, and allow your weight to rock back on your heels and then back to your back. Keep that same curved position in order to dissipate the fall, and as you feel the base of your shoulder blades touch the ground, go ahead and slap the mat. Once you've done that, come back up and you can try it again. Take one look at it from the side. Like I said, our end goal is to do this from a standing position. So our next step is to come up to fully standing position and execute the fall. From here, whenever we get ready to do the fall, we're going to lower our hips first, bending at the knees. We're going to make sure that our butt is the first portion of our body to touch the ground. Then we're going to keep the curve in our back and use the same striking technique. Exhaling as we hit the ground, keeping our chin tucked. Take a look at it from this angle. The next technique that we want to incorporate is we want to get a more aggressive action pushing us to the ground. So what we'll do is we'll use a training partner and incorporate a push. I'm going to use my assistant Peter to demonstrate the technique. The way it'll work is with my partner completely relaxed, I'll simply give him a hard and forceful shove. Once he feels the shove, he'll execute the technique and fall properly. Remember, whenever you go down, as soon as your shoulder blades touch the ground, keep your back curved and extend your hands, slapping the mat. Don't overemphasize the slap, and forcibly exhale. Let's look at it one more time. As I'm pushing, I can also incorporate the fact of having him close his eyes so that he gets a more unexpected push, so that he's not really anticipating the shove. Each time, he's going to want to execute the same technique using the same mechanics of the fall. Let's take a look at another fall that we may need in order to properly defend against a throw that may be used against us. The next one we're going to look at is a side break fall. Once again, we're going to begin in that seated position down on the ground as if we're watching television. From here, I'm going to turn to my side, lift my arm up and across my body, and I'm going to direct my fall toward the side of my back. As I fall, I'm going to bring my hand up across in front of me, extend my lower leg, and keep this leg bent. I'll simply turn, fall, and remember to overemphasize the breathing. It should look something like this. Using the same principle of progression, once I've gained the body mechanics from a seated position, I'm going to want to come up to squatting. From here, I'm simply going to kick my leg out and begin to lay my leg down sideways. I want to make gradual contact with my leg, starting at the side of my foot, then the ankle, and completely up the side of my body. It should look something like this. As I'm falling to the side, I want to keep my other hand up to defend my face. Because keep in mind, this is a defensive technique against a throw. And if an enemy's thrown me, he's going to want to follow up with strikes once I'm on the ground. In order to continue that same progression, we'll demonstrate this from a standing technique. I'll simply take my foot, place it out to the side by crossing my legs, and put the blade edge of my foot down on the mat. Then I'll gradually lay my leg down and complete the fall. The one thing that I want to avoid is making any hard bone contact with any portion of my body. I want to gradually lay my body down and absorb the throw. One technique we can use to help practice the force of this technique in order to get proper mechanics for this fall is a pull method. What I'll do is I'll simply have my opponent or my partner get in a kneeling position. He'll reach his arm across and I'll grasp his wrist. From here, I'm simply going to pull start him like a lawnmower and he'll execute the side break fall. Okay? This helps generate the force without going from a complete standing position or a throw in order to properly execute the move. Let's look at it one more time. He'll reach through and give me his hand. I'll grasp his wrist. From here, I'll just simply start the lawnmower. He'll execute the proper fall, and it'll help us train these skills. One more falling or break fall technique that we want to work on is a front roll. This technique actually uses our momentum of the fall in order to regain our feet. We're going to begin from down on the ground once again. This time we'll start from a kneeling position. In a kneeling position, with one knee down and my other leg up, what I'm going to do is begin by forming a triangle with my hands. As I form the triangle, I'm going to place it on the mat directly in front of my front leg. As I do that, I'm going to make a circle with my arms. What I want to create is kind of a hula hoop effect or a wheel, because I'm going to be rolling across my arms and shoulders. Then I'll simply place it down, pointing my elbow in the direction I'm going to roll, and then I'll lift my hip up over my shoulders. It'll look like this. And I want to roll through and come back to that same position. As I'm rolling to execute the move, I want to make sure that I keep my shoulders nice and rounded and that I exhale as I roll through and my shoulders strike the ground. We're We're going to use this technique whenever we're thrown in order to use the momentum and try to regain our feet. In order to do that, let's look at that same technique from more of a standing angle. When I'm standing, in order to do this, what I'll do is I'll simply take a step, position my hands downward, and start to ease my body toward the ground. As I step through, I'll continue to point my elbow, and then pushing with my rear leg, I'll extend my hip up over my shoulders. I want to roll through and actually use that momentum to regain my feet. That'll bring me back up to an upright position. Once you're comfortable with the technique standing, then we're going to want to pick up the pace and do it at a slow jog or even running. So at a slow jog, you'll jog in, execute the roll, and bring it back up to your feet. We want to make sure that we use these techniques in order to come back upright. We can also, using this same technique, incorporate our side fall. In order to take a look at how that combines, from an upright position, we'll step forward, roll through, and execute the side fall. We'll execute the side fall whenever we want to break the force of the fall rather than gain the momentum and come back upright. One last break fall that we're going to want to look at is the front break fall. It just may happen that we're attacked from the rear and we don't see it. If we're surprised and push forward, we need to be able to stop that fall in order to protect ourselves. We'll begin down on the ground again from a kneeling position. From here, I'm going to want to fall forward. As I fall forward, I want to bring my hands up in front of my face and turn my head to the side, either the left or the right. It doesn't matter. As I fall, I want to arch my body so that my chest, my hips, and eventually even my knees don't make contact with the ground. I'll fall forward and it'll look like this. As I'm falling on this portion of my arms. I want to avoid falling on my arms completely outstretched because there's a good chance that I could hurt myself. I may even wind up with a wrist fracture. So as I fall forward, I'm catching myself with this portion of the forearm. I'm also keeping my body up off the ground. Once I'm comfortable at a kneeling position and feel like I can catch my fall, I'll move up to a squatting position. This will give me an opportunity to increase the force of the fall and gain some proficiency in breaking the fall. From here, as I fall forward, I'm going to extend my knees, keep my weight up on my toes. So when I fall forward, I'm keeping my entire body, except for my forearms and my toes, off the ground. Once I'm comfortable from this position, I'll be ready to move on up to a standing position. From here, I'm going to fall forward, make sure that I keep my knees and the rest of my body up off the mat. Just my forearms, my toes are going to support me. Remember, as soon as you make contact with the mat, forcibly exhale. And those are the techniques that we're going to use to defend ourselves against throws that are employed against us. It'll help protect us from the injuries we may receive if we go down on the ground unexpectedly. Now that we've covered some falling techniques that'll help you feel comfortable, let's move on to some takedowns. Our objective in this fight is to close distance and gain the clinch. The clinch position is a control position that'll help us determine the best takedown to use. The way it'll work is as my attacker comes in, I'm going to move to a position where I'm clinched with him. The clinching position puts me in control of his arm, pulling it across his body, my hand on his hip and pulling his hips close to mine, my feet positioned on either side of his near leg, and my head turned inward so that I can protect my eyes. As I turn my head inward, I use his arm to cover my eyes so that he can't gouge them. From here, I'll use his reaction to determine which takedown I'm going to use to get to the ground. There are a couple key signs that we're looking for once we get into the clinch. The first thing I'm looking for is how he reacts to the clinch that he's in. Most people aren't comfortable with that type of close contact, especially in a confrontation. So when I close distance, get my hands on him and gain control, he will immediately react, and I want to capitalize on his reaction. One common reaction that you'll see, once we're in the clinch and we get here, he'll attempt to pull his arm up and away to free it. As he pulls his arm up and away in this direction, he lifts his center of balance. When he does that, I'm going to allow some room with my hand on his hip and step around in front, positioning my feet inside of his. I'll slide my other foot up and form a box so that my feet are inside of his and they form the four corners of a square. 1, 2, 3, and 4. From here, I'll lower my legs, use my hips to scoop his weight, and then throw him. Let's first look at how we'll pick him up and gain his balance, kind of capturing it so that he's set up for the throw. Move into the clinch, allow some room, slide around, and lift. Once we get to this position, in order to finish the throw, I'll simply take my head and rotate my head and shoulder down to the opposite knee. As I do that, I'll follow through by pointing my fingers to the ground. You want to ensure that you use powerful hip rotation in order to gain leverage for the throw. Should look like this. Once I've executed the throw, I'm going to have control of this arm. I don't want to keep it for some techniques that we're going to talk about later, some follow-ups. Let's look at that from one more angle. Hopefully that shot gave you a look at the footwork, so let's look at it one last time. Remember to keep control of the arm and to maintain your own balance. If you feel yourself starting to be pulled forward and over, simply lower your hips, and you can even be more forceful by placing your knee aggressively in his ribs. Some other options that we can use based on the reaction we get from our opponent include what's known as a leg sweep takedown. If I'm squared off with my opponent, we get to the clinch. Instead of pulling his arm away this time, he's going to step away with his leg in order to try to get away and remove that uncomfortable feeling of having me close to him. As he steps, I'm going to let my front foot step with him, and then I'm going to take my back foot and wrap it around his leg. As I wrap it around his leg, I'm going to scoop it up and pick it up off the mat. When I pick it up, I'm going to push with my head and push his back toward the ground. As I do that, there'll be a point where I feel that he loses his balance. Once I feel that he's lost his balance, then I'll place my foot back on the mat. Should look like this. Let's take a look at it one more time at a more regular speed. As I lift my foot and I feel him go off balance, I push with my head and then I replace the foot. As he goes down and falls, I'll release my hands from around him, gain control of my descent, and lower myself to the ground. Let's look at it one more time. As he goes down, I'm going to want to follow him because I want to wind up in this key ground position known as the mount. And we'll talk about that in a later tape. Let's take one final look at this technique at a normal speed. Remember to cover your opponent once you get to the ground and be prepared for a follow-up technique. One other reaction that your opponent may have is once you're in the clinch, he may decide to turn toward you. in order to try to aggressively react to what you're doing. This time, he's going to turn toward me. As he turns toward me, I'm going to take my rear hand, slide it across his back, and form a very straight line at the top of his pants. As I do that, with my palm down, I'm going to make a fist. Then I'm going to take my other hand, place the pinky in the notch of my forearm, right at my wrist, and then I'm going to pull him towards me. As I pull him towards me, I'm going to push with my forehead. Once I feel his balance break, then I'll step and allow him to go to the ground. I'll release my hands and control my own descent. Once again, following him to the ground in order to maintain control. Once we get here, I want to be prepared to follow up right away. Let's look at it again. And this will take us down to the ground where we can nullify his larger size and greater strength. Let's take one more look at that. And this is where we eventually want to wind up, in the mounted position. One more reaction that we may get from an opponent is that instead of pulling his arm, turning towards us, or stepping away, he may decide that he feels us attempting to take him down. So he may drop his weight and try to settle into a solid base in order to stay upright. If he does, there's another option we'll use. Let's take a look at that right now. Once again, from the clinch, as soon as I feel him drop his weight, I'm going to move to a position more behind him. I'm going to slide my foot even with his. Then I'm going to take my rear leg and slide it across behind him. As I slide it across behind him, I must ensure that I keep my knee bent and I face the sole of my foot toward the back of his leg. Once I do that, I'm simply going to sit from this hip down toward my heel and pull him backwards. It'll look like this. Once again, as I bring him down to the ground, I'm going to want to follow through and gain the mounted position. Let's take another look at it. At a more normal speed, it should look something like this. And still, we want to wind up here in order to deliver a finishing technique on the ground. From a different angle, here's how it'll look. And once again, this is the position we want to wind up in. This is known as a rear drop takedown. Anytime that our opponent drops his weight and lowers his center of gravity, this is how we're going to adjust to take him to the ground. Now that we've covered some aggressive takedown combinations, let's take a look at some more subtle techniques that we may need to use whenever we're dealing with civilians, non-combatants, or maybe even a hostage rescue situation where the hostage is a little frantic. One of the things we can do is when people try to grab us, we can take control of their wrist, and we can use that to take them to the ground. We can do it gently, or we can escalate the amount of force to make it a powerful takedown technique. As the person comes forward and grabs us with their hand, we're going to want to take control of the wrist. As we take control of the wrist, we're going to reach up with the same hand on the same side, and then we're going to grab it, placing our fingers in the crease of the palm. Once the fingers are in the crease of the palm, we're going to grab and place the back portion of the hand with our thumb across this joint. As we do that, we're going to rotate our arm up because we want to make sure that we block ourselves in case the grab is followed by a punch. So we're going to rotate our arm high and turn to the outside. As we turn outward, we're going to rotate the wrist over in a small circular motion. As we rotate it in this small circular motion, we're going to push his elbow toward him and take a step. It'll look something like this. As we rotate, the more quickly we turn our body and the tighter the circle, the more force the throw has. Let's take a look at it from another angle. After we take him to the ground, once again, we want to maintain control of the arm so that we can execute follow-up techniques if he's a more aggressive attacker. We can kick to the head from here, or we can go into other arm locks and arm bars. Let's look at it one more time. This outside wrist lock will be useful to you anytime somebody comes up and places a firm grasp on you. These same techniques are applicable for joint manipulation once you're down on the ground. Don't rely on these type of precision techniques in an all-out striking confrontation, because when people are swinging blows at you, it's difficult to grab and control their wrist. Let's take a look at one more option of a wrist lock if we're grabbed in a different fashion. If he grabs me with the other hand, this time I may want to keep my near side available to block what I believe is a punch that could be coming. From here, I'm going to reach over and grab with the opposite hand, at the same time grabbing with the hand on the same side. From here, I'm going to rotate my body inward. As I rotate my body inward, I'm going to pull the arm, pulling his body close to my hip and resting his shoulder on my thigh. In order to maintain control and exert pain for compliance, I'm going to drop my weight and push upward against the back of the elbow underneath my arm. Let's look at it one more time. Where I eventually want to wind up is with control here, so that I have his shoulder braced against my thigh. I'm squatting down, placing my weight on the back of his elbow and pushing upward with my arms. This will exert pain and pressure on the elbow so I can gain compliance. Let's take one last look at it. Both of these wrist locks are very capable of taking the opponent down. They give you an opportunity for control without being overly forceful for a person who may not be an all-out enemy. In this next segment, we're going to take a look at some combinations that we can put together in order to elicit takedowns. The first one we're going to take a look at is a parry block with a head and arm takedown. If an attacker comes at me throwing a rear hand strike, I'm going to parry the blow, slide in, place my arm up and around his neck, and apply pressure. I'm trapping his arm against his head and using my arm to push this bone against the nerve in his neck. From here, I'm going to grab, bring my elbow in against the side of his back, and gain control in a nice tight position. I'm going to allow some room with my feet. I'm going to step out and around and bring him back across my foot. Once I get him to the ground here, I'm going to pin him with my knee, and I can follow up from there. I can either move to the mounted position, or I can execute some other arm locks and techniques that'll be effective here. Let's look at that from one more angle. And eventually, I want to wind up in a position of control where I can finish the fight. Let's take a last look at the parry to the inside with a head and arm takedown. This is only one of the combinations that we can use to take the opponent down effectively and gain control. One more that we can use is a high block cover against a hook style punch into a leg sweep. It'll look something like this. As he throws a strike, I'll cover and block to protect my head. Once I have control of the arm from making the strike, I'll bring my hand down and gain control of the arm. Once I have control of the arm, and I'm here, my other hand's going to rest on his shoulder. From here, I'm going to push my elbow tightly against his chest, hold his arm snugly underneath my arm and allow enough room to step through and hook the back of his heel. The step and the footwork is key here. I'm going to place all my weight on this foot, lean forward so that I'm pushing and he can't push me off balance, pushing very firmly against his chest with my elbow, and hook his foot and pull it back underneath him. Once again, I'll push him down to the ground, maintain control of the arm, and be prepared to finish up with either an arm lock technique or move to the mounted position for some other type of finishing move. Let's look at that one from another angle. And one last time, this is how it should look from a different angle. And this is where I want to wind up. In firm control of this arm, with him on the ground, and me still being able to be upright. Let's take a look at one more combination we can use that contains that same arm reap and leg sweep. If I have an attacker coming at me, and this time, instead of trying to punch me, he's trying to tackle me and take me to the ground. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a V-block. A V-block is nothing more than when I extend my arms slightly more than 90 degrees, and I actually strike him across his clavicle and his bicep to stop the charge. From there, let's take a look at it from this angle. From there, once I've stopped the charge, I'll reap the arm and use that same foot sweep takedown to get my opponent to the ground. Once again, I'll wind up here, where I've got him down on the ground, I'm controlling the arm, and I have my weight on him, so I can transition to a finishing technique on the ground. Let's look at it again. From a different angle, once he comes, I'm going to stop his charge with the V-block, reap the arm, gain positive control of it, pin my arm to his chest, step through, and hook his foot, sweeping it out from underneath of him. Taking him to the mat, gaining control. Let's take a last look at it from one more angle. And this is where I want to control him. He's on the ground, I'm still upright and able to direct the momentum of the fight. Using that same V-block to stop the charge on a tackle, we have some other options that we can employ. If he comes forward to tackle me, I can block with the V-block, and from here, simply drag his arm across, bring my arm around in front of his throat, and come to a rear choke. Let's look at that from a different angle. I'm going to stop the charge with the V-block, drag his arm around in front, rotate my hand through, twisting his body, gaining control in the rear choke. Let's look at it at a more normal speed. I can continue to choke him in a slightly upright position, or I can take him completely to the ground. The rear choke's a very effective finishing move. And let's look at another option where we can use that V-block. Using that same V-block, I'm going to stop the charge once again. From here, I'm going to trap the arm and hook the back of the head. Once I hook the back of the head, I'm going to deliver some powerful knee strikes underneath the chin or to the throat. From a different angle, it'll look like this. Remember to be very careful whenever you're practicing this technique with your partner, because without the proper safety gear, you've got the potential to really injure someone. Let's take one last look at it. As he comes in, I'm going to stop the charge. Gain control of the head, step back, locking the back of his head, I'm going to deliver the knee strikes. I can deliver multiple knee strikes, and I can also add in other devastating striking techniques, like elbows and even a headbutt. but the knee is going to be my primary means of progressing with the confrontation. Let's take a look at one more technique that we can add into that last combination to make it even more effective. When the attacker comes at me, I'm going to use that same V block followed up by a knee strike. I'm going to stop the charge with the V block and then deliver the knee strike. After delivering the knee strike, in order to have more control and immediately finish the fight, I'm going to transition to a front choke. I'm going to slide my arm up, bring it down and around his neck so that I position it across his trachea. I'm going to release my other hand, slide it underneath, and grasp my own wrist. I'm going to grasp my own wrist by placing this pinky in the notch on my arm. Once I have it here, I'm going to pull my palm inward and toward my body as I stand up and arch backward. It'll look like this. From here, I can go ahead and choke until I have complete compliance or until the opponent is unconscious and I can move on. If I come up against a taller opponent and I have a lot of problems gaining enough power, or if the situation requires that I lower my center of gravity and get down out of the line of fire, I can go ahead and drop to the ground and bring him inside my legs into what's known as a guard position. That'll look like this. From here, I can extend my legs and continue to apply the choke, arching my back and looking upward until I have enough pressure to go ahead and complete the choke and render him unconscious. Because the front choke is such a devastating technique, let's take a look at a couple combinations and counters we can use in order to defend ourselves against it. If I wind up in the front choke for any reason, something goes wrong, the attacker gets the upper hand on me, and I wind up there, I want to immediately defend myself. The first thing I want to consider is blocking this arm that's going to be directly across my trachea. I want to protect my airway and keep that off my throat. Once I have this under control, I want to also make sure that I'm conscious of these knee strikes that could be employed against me. I'll bring my arm down to block, keep control of this arm, keeping it off my neck. Once I'm comfortable with this position, I'll then swim with my arm coming up over his head in a swimming motion in order to gain control of his head. Once I have control of his head, I'll release my grip on his arm and grab him in a front choke that's similar to the lock he has on me. From here, to counter the move, I'll drop to my knee and throw my arm up and over, pushing him to his back. It'll look like this. Once I get to this position, I'm now free of the front choke, and I'm able to move on to another finishing technique. I can either strike with my elbow or move to a better position. Let's take a look at that same technique from another angle. If I find myself in the front choke, I'm immediately going to defend the arm across my neck. With my other arm, I'm going to block the knees to protect myself against knee strikes. I'm going to bring my arm up and over his head in a swimming motion, grab it, gain control, and then drop to my knee, rotating and pushing him to his back. As I push him to his back, I become free of the headlock. And now I'm able to move on to my next technique. There's another technique that I can use to defend myself against this front choke. If I find myself in the front choke, once again, I'm going to immediately block and secure his arm that he's trying to choke me with. From here, using the same concept, I'm going to block the knee by bracing my hand against it. From here, I'm going to shoot my leg through his legs, sitting down and rolling him with his hips over his head. It'll look like this. From here, once I'm free of the choke, I want to rotate into a more comfortable position of control. I can turn away from him, rotating once again to that side mount position for strikes, or I can further move into a mounted position. Let's look at that from one more angle. He gains the front choke. I'm going to block and defend. My hand is going to come down, block the leg, and then I'm going to sit through between his legs and drop to the ground. As I drop to the ground, I'm going to push with my arm, lifting his leg further up over his hips. Then I'm going to rotate into a position so I have some control of the situation. That gives us a couple of options to defend ourselves against the front choke. Let's take a look at one last devastating throw that you can use to take your opponent to the ground. If I have an attacker advancing on me, I want to gain control of the wrist. As soon as I have control of the wrist, I'm going to step in, elevate the arm, and rotate it above my head. I'm going to slide my hips in perpendicular to him and bring him across my back. From here, I'm going to rotate my shoulders, throwing him across my back. It should look like this. Once I make the throw, I want to maintain control of the arm. This gives me an opportunity for other finishing follow-up techniques. That last throw that we practice has the potential to be a very devastating maneuver. So be careful when you're practicing. Use proper padding until you get the hang of it. And remember to be very careful with your training partner. We've talked about several things in this video. We've covered many options in order to take your opponent to the ground where you can begin ground fighting that we'll talk about in the next video. You want to use this opportunity to take an opponent to an area where he's not comfortable. You want to bring him down on the ground where you've honed your skills and you can use that to your advantage. After all, you wouldn't want to go in the water after a shark. You'd want to bring him out on land and make shark steaks. And that's what we want to do. We want to bring him to our arena so we can fight where we're most comfortable and we've got the upper hand.